Hi, everyone. Welcome back. So glad to be here this morning on Sunday with you. If you're in the US time zones, that is. But I'm so honored to be able to introduce to you right now an incredible whistleblower, a person with serious integrity, Bill Binney, former NSA technical director and founding member of VIPS, which is Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. And there are so many other brilliant things that you've done and accomplished that it would take me almost the whole segment to list them all. But I just want to say that we are all humbled that you're here with us, and thank you for joining us.
Well, it's good to be with you. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Very welcome. So what I know that your decision to kind of step away from the NSA in 2001, that long predated the creation of WikiLeaks. What was it? What was the first thing you noticed about WikiLeaks that drew your attention to it, and then enough to garner your personal support for them?
Well, for me, it was, I was sitting in the midst of organizations whose they were totally dysfunctional. The only thing they did was lie to one another. Even internally in NSA, they lied to each other. And then they lie from one agency to the other, and then they lie to our government. I mean, you can see how they did that with weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You can see it with the Tonkin Gulf affair in Vietnam. Which got us into another war, killing a lot of people, all based on a lie. And then also you could see the lies about we're not spying on our own citizens, we're not spying on individuals in the world. It's just their entire way of operating is based on lies. And for me, I'm a simple country boy, basically from Pennsylvania. I can't keep the lies straight. So, when I tell somebody a lie, I can't keep it straight. I have to know that I told this lie to that person, this lie to that one. I mean, it's just too hard to do. So I can't do that. So I basically was dealing on the truth. And then when they started, violating the fundamental principles of the founding of our nation, which is based on the Constitution and human rights, I just couldn't take anymore. That was I had to get out of the place, and I had to start talking openly about it, because when they, for example, with the Department of Justice and the FBI, they would manufacture evidence to try to indict people. Excuse me. That was kind of the bottom line. I mean, you're trying to indict your own people to keep them quiet from telling the truth. This is so the whole thing is based on lies and just corruption and fraud. So I just had a hard time staying involved in any way whatsoever. So at that point, I just said, I'm done, I'm out. So I was eligible to retire, so I retired and got out.
Well, it's incredible to hear that, because a lot of people will say, oh, I don't like what the NSA has done here and there. Same with the CIA. And then the counter to that usually is somebody saying, oh, but there are good people in the NSA and there are good people in the CIA. Sure. And those like yourself and Ray McGovern are proof of that. But the issue that I think that moves out of that recognition that you and Ray are all good people who served in these agencies is the fact that you had to retire and that you had to go out of the agency. I mean, that shows that these agencies are not allowing people who want to do the right thing to flourish and to move forward. It's definitely backwards, it seems like.
Yeah, I called it basically, I looked at it as evil at the top, determining the outcome of the organization. And see, that was just totally unacceptable to me. I mean, I just couldn't participate in that. And it basically was corrupting. It was they were controlling the narrative, basically, that the population of the country was able to hear. And when the mainstream media, which over here is kind of a part of that organizational effort, I mean, they certainly support it in every way possible. They simply spew forth the narrative out of the administration's agencies, like the idea that that Russia was hacking into the DNC, and there was no absolute challenge to any of that. No technical, expertise applied to that. They simply said it, and then everybody repeated it. And it goes back to the old sophist technique of tell a lie, tell it often until everybody believes it. And if you tell it from many different directions, supposedly from people in positions of authority, then people tend to believe it a lot faster. And so then you can simply reinforce that and keep saying it over and over and over again. And then it just becomes, oh yeah, we all know that, that's got to be true because everybody's saying it. Well, when in fact you take a close look at it, you find out everything was a fabrication, everything was a fake and a setup. And that's what's not happening. We don't have that disciplined, rigorous view from certainly the mainstream media is not performing their function under the First Amendment of the Constitution of free press to find out really what the government's doing and then tell us. They're not doing that anymore. So I'm voting to remove them from the First Amendment.
Well, I think that the only organization that is holding the feet of the establishment to the fire is WikiLeaks, and it's really, really concerning that yes, they're the only really truly functioning organization that that now is being persecuted for being a successful journalistic outlet. So,
well, but
the hypocrisy
as a dysfunctional organization like our governments are, you can't allow the truth out. So you have to suppress it, to minimize it, to, try to get the masses of the public to disbelieve it. So if you say somebody's publishing the truth, well, you say they're compromising classified information, they're endangering lives, anything to divert from the attention of the public from the real basic issue that was exposed, by that organization, like WikiLeaks, for example. I mean, if governments if they stopped and thought about it for a minute, if they did the right thing from the beginning as best they could, then these problems wouldn't occur. No one would feel they'd have to expose this terrible, injustice or, criminality by our governments or agencies of the government. You wouldn't have that problem. So, for example, Edward Snowden wouldn't have come out if he didn't see all this wrongdoing in government. So, it's a matter of government actually being honest, even with itself. That's the real problem. They live on a basis of lies and they can't get out of it. It's ingrained in them so deeply that they can't get past it.
Absolutely. And I think that going back to what you were talking about with the hierarchy and that evil rising to the top, that just further ingrains that type of self-protective attempt to kind of just draw back from the revelation of the truth, as opposed to deal with it head on and fix it, fix the fact that the CIA had its security breached to the point that Vault 7 was able to then be published. So, coming from your experience and your perspective, can you comment on the words of somebody like Mike Pompeo, now Secretary of State, formerly the CIA director? What do you think about what do you think about an advisor to Trump using terminology and language to describe WikiLeaks as a hostile intelligence service and directly compare them with Al-Qaeda? How does that?
Actually, you see, you have to understand. I mean, he was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was in intelligence committees and so on in Congress and so on. So, he has to support the existing structure. So I think he's motivated by going along to get along. To me, that's not the way to run business. These are organizations and operations that have been festering inside the government for decades. And the only way to clean them out is to actually face them, admit them, and deal with them. For example, when Diane Rourke, who was then at the time of 2002, early 2002, February, she was a member of the staff of the House Intelligence Committee. She arranged to have me and a couple other people meet with at the time he was Representative Burr in the House, on the House Intelligence Committee. Now he's Senator Burr, the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee. And so she arranged a meeting with us to talk to him. This was about NSA and all the spying and the corruption and fraud and so on. So we went in and explained to him all about the Stellar Wind program, the domestic spying program here in the United States, and also all the corruption and fraud between relationships between companies and NSA, and how they were squandering billions of dollars. He at the end of it, after we went through all of this, at the end he said to us, well, we all know that NSA is really messed up, but now is not the time to fix it. Now, think about it. This is, you just had a major intelligence mess up with 9/11 a few months before this, and you're being explaining all the problems that existed, which manifested in the outcome of 9/11 and other incidents since then. And here is a man who's in a position to say something or influence it. And he says, well, we know it's messed up, but now it's not the time to fix it. Well, if you never fix it, these problems simply fester and continue and actually get worse over time, as it is now, as you could see that. I mean, this is standard human nature. This is the way humans operate. So if you can't be an adult and face the problem and deal with it, you never fix it, and it's always with you. And so that's the evil at the top, generating this atmosphere that basically perpetuates everything that's going on here and around the world now, with all the other countries that have joined NSA and the US government and what they're doing.
Absolutely. And I want to also ask, moving away a little bit from the various intelligence agencies that we've just discussed, I'd like to hear from your perspective. Have you visited with Julian Assange while he's been in the embassy? And I just wanted to hear any thoughts you had on what's going on with him right now in his current condition, in the extreme isolation he's suffering.
Well, I think it's basically the kind of torture techniques that they used in various places in the world, in the black sites, and various like Gitmo and also prisons in Iraq. Excuse me. So I think it's a technique that psychologists helped develop with CIA as to how to treat people, isolate them, make them feel very, isolated and limited and everything, and basically make them psychologically turn on themselves fundamentally. I think that's the objective here. I just think that that's a basic violation of human rights. I mean, certainly I think the European Union courts have said that already about Julian's incarceration. So, I don't, this is consistent with the evil at the top and generated principles and governance that are coming down. And at the end, you can see it already in the interrogations we're having with the FBI and what they were doing internally in the politics of the U.S. and criminality of spying on U.S. citizens, U.S. Political opponents, basically. And now, since it's affecting the politicians, they're starting to speak out, right? Because up until then, it was just affecting we peons, So we didn't matter. The unwashed masses don't count. But those who are in political power, they're the ones that are important. So now they're speaking out because it's hitting them. But it's just a standard technique that has come down through history. It's nothing new. I mean, humanity has operated this way for millennia. I mean, ever since people have organized into cities and and countries and organizations, why people do these things. That's all. And it's really generated, and you can fundamentally think of it as going down to three words governing the principles of people in power. That is, they want to keep the power. Power, money, and control are the issues. And if you think about it that way, following the money, you look for the people, you find the power they have and the control they have, and it all fits together. And one has to balance off against the other. This is an exercise in power. That's all it is. And it's a basic violation of human rights.
Definitely. I could not agree more with that statement. I think it's so valuable to have you speaking with us specifically, not only because of your long tenure with the NSA, but because of your being a technical director and that kind of unique perspective on everything that we're seeing. So I was wondering about, like, for example, when WikiLeaks released Vault 7, a lot of kind of propaganda narratives were spun saying they had released these weapons, or they had damaged the world by publishing this. But what WikiLeaks says on its press release is that they have actively taken out the parts of the information that would allow it to be used as a weapon. So you don't have every 15-year-old who's interested or having access to these tools. So what, from your perspective, how would you clarify that WikiLeaks is a journalistic outlet, a publisher, as opposed to a hostile intelligence service, as Pompeo has called it?
I would put it pretty simply. If you're looking for truth in publications, there's not too many places to look. And certainly WikiLeaks has a standing record of telling the truth for over a decade. So, but coming to Vault 7, this has been a problem with me for quite some time. For a number of years, I've been complaining about this. And the reason is pretty simple. I call this the second swindle of the public of the world, by the way. And it's called cybersecurity. Okay. The problem I see with this is, here we have these intelligence agencies. It's not just NSA and CIA. It's GCHQ. It's the BND. It's basically all agencies in the world. They look for weaknesses in systems so they can break into those systems and see what people are saying. Whether it's encryption or networks or operating system or firewalls to get through the firewalls and things like that. So these are all the types of things that these attacks represent, how to do that. And they're functionally looking at the weaknesses in the original code, or weaknesses they can kind of manipulate into the system, implant, and so on. But the point is, they know about all these weaknesses. And they've known for decades and are doing nothing about it because they want to read what everybody's doing. That's operationally, that's what they want to do. So that means we're all sitting out here, fat, dumb, and happy, being weak and vulnerable to anybody who discovers any one of these weaknesses over any period of time. However many decades it takes for somebody to find it. Once they find it, they can use it. And in fact, they have known, these intelligence agencies have known about these weaknesses for those decades, and they've done absolutely nothing to fix them. So they meant that we were all so insecure already. We were setups basically, so the Chinese could come in and do things like tap out the operation of the OPM files on everybody in the United States that ever had a clearance. They take all that data, and hey, and so, and then you can have these other, like, WannaCry virus can come around, those kinds of things. If you have those kinds of weaknesses and don't fix them, everybody's laying out there vulnerable to these kinds of attacks. And then once these attacks happen, and here's where the swindle comes in, they say, we need more money for cybersecurity. When in fact, they already knew the problems existing, most of them, or a good many of them, and they didn't fix them. So if you don't fix something, you can't have cybersecurity. But if you let it open, and this is the evil in it, you let it open to be attacked so you can swindle the people. And that's really what's been going on. So my problem with it is, they should have fixed all these problems decades ago, and they should fix them as they discover them, and then maybe we'll have some cybersecurity.
Absolutely. It's very much, it seems to be a fantastic example of creating the problem and in order to come in and fix it.
Or like taking advantage of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Never fixing it. Yeah.
So what are, What are some of the ways that you think that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have revolutionized journalism? Just, especially when you look back to when VIPS was standing up against what you all called faulty intelligence relating to WMDs and weapons of mass destruction. How do you compare that era where there was no WikiLeaks to what we're seeing now, and the way that WikiLeaks has been able to publish so many documents related to warfare and war crimes?
Well, I think you could basically liken it to what is being said for the last year and a half about the Russia attack. You had people claiming things, and there was no evidence being produced by them to do anything. And as I said to Director Pompeo when I visited him last October, I think it was, and the point is that when you have a serious situation, and you've got people in our Congress here saying this Russiagate thing is an act of war, things of that nature. When you have very serious things like that, and you're going to try to tell the people in the country that this is an act of war and that we need to do something about this, you need to produce evidence that will show unequivocally that it's true. So far, you haven't done that. And then I point back to President Kennedy, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when that crisis came in and they were getting very close to its closest we've ever come to conflict with the Soviet Union. And that was, they went to DEFCON, Defense Condition 2, which is just the next step down from war. Why he produced the photographs of the missiles in Cuba from the U-2 planes. And he presented them in the United Nations and said, here are your missiles in Cuba. And wow. And then when the North Koreans shot down the South Korean airline over Sakhalin Island, or shortly after it passed over Sakhalin Island, President Reagan came out and produced the air-to-ground control of the fighters, the Russian air-to-ground control fighters, ordering them to shoot it down. And that was a Japanese intercept of their communications. And so he produced that to the UN. So if you have serious situations, the precedent is set where you actually show evidence to produce the evidence in public so that people can see that it's really true that what you're saying. I mean, because if you're talking about that, like in the case of the weapons of mass destruction, nobody challenged that. Okay, and in the case here, that nobody was challenging the Russiagate thing. So you have the same kind of analogy where if you don't demand evidence and have a checkable evidence that's in the public domain by governments, then how can you believe them? So, that's directly analogous to that. I mean, it's the same. They're trying to control the narrative, keep the truth out of the public domain. And that's the benefit of WikiLeaks and other organizations attempting to do this. If they're putting the truth out there, and nobody who's built and operating on lies can actually stand up to it. So they have to try to suppress it, and they'll do it any way they can. And this is a clear example of that, what they're doing to Julian.
I absolutely agree, and I'm concerned very much by the escalation of a relationship between the U.S. and Ecuador in the last few weeks.
Yeah.
And so I wondered also from your perspective, how do you see the situation moving forward? I know I don't want to be somebody casting doom and gloom unnecessarily, and I'm not asking you to be too optimistic, but I think it would be great to hear from you about what you think could happen moving forward. And then also, what can we do to help it be the best outcome possible?
Well, that's a hard one to answer. It really is, because you have all this diplomatic pressure and money under the table back and forth between governments and influence that way. That the U.S. has a lot of influence in that direction because they have a lot of foreign aid and trade and so on to be used as leverage. So it's hard to see publicly what pressures they're putting on Ecuador to do things. But certainly some of them appear to be working, don't they? From the reactions that are occurring. So we can only, kind of try to guess at what exactly they're saying because they're not telling you. I mean, again, it's the based on control the narrative kind of thing. Because if they came out in the open and said exactly what they're talking about, like being honest with us, then people would obviously they're afraid of the reaction of people in the publics, not just in Ecuador, but also in the United States. I mean, because a lot of people just wouldn't think that that's too terribly humane, for example, or that it's not conforming with our constitutional founding principles. So, that's the thing they're trying to avoid, and I call that sunlight. The truth is sunlight, and we really need a lot more truth and sunlight in the world. So that's why I think WikiLeaks performs an extremely valuable function, as do others who are attempting to do this. Whereas the mainstream media is not performing their function, which is to find the truth in what government is doing and inform the public what the government is doing in their behalf. This is why they're in the First Amendment of the Constitution. But they're no longer doing that. They're simply acquiescing. And a lot of it, if you look at it, is who owns the media outlets and what is their commercial extension, and how does that commercial extension fit into the U.S. government, contracts, so on, and whether or not the FCC gives them rights or something, or it has a chance to cancel their ability to broadcast or things like that. And you can see the influence and the corruption and the incestuous relationship in what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. And he took government out of that too, by the way. He originally had government in there. So it was really originally the government military-industrial complex. Because if you looked at it, in the intelligence side, it's the intelligence agencies that are actually the committees in Congress that are actually supporting all of this bulk acquisition and spying on everyone. And it's really the agencies in government that are lobbied so heavily by those corporations and so on to conform to that incestuous relationship and really scratch each other's backs. So, there's really the corruption goes much further than this. Now it's international too, because these are international companies, and it's not just the US, it's the UK, it's Germany, it's France, it's everybody. So, from in spying alone, there's like 33 countries worldwide that are cooperating with the US and the UK in the Five Eyes. And then within that, there's about 9 of those other countries, other than the Five Eyes, that are also participating in this bulk acquisition of data. So these are the cooperative efforts, and they build hinges and links and leverage to one another. And although I don't know that Ecuador is a part of that, but certainly and commercially, they're part of some kind of relationship with the US. So that's leverage, and they use that. And they also use all the spying as a way to reinforce leverage and add leverage to other countries, like to their parliaments or prime ministers or presidents, whichever they have. If you're spying on them and have all the data about them, you've got power over them. And so you can use that also. So it's really, it's such an incestuous, we call it over here, the shadow government and the deep state, if you will. If you want to call it that, you can call it that.
Yeah, I like both of those terms, as well as unelected power structures, but they're all fine. But I think that what you're saying is so important to kind of contrast with the way in which WikiLeaks is protecting us from the abuses of government. Not that they can go prevent them, but by allowing us to see in detail in primary source documents what that corruption is. I think that moving or adding to what you have said about the way that it is such an incestuous kind of type of corruption, it then that makes WikiLeaks like the last buffer between us and complete control of the narrative by a corrupt establishment.
So. Yep, that's what I see, and unfortunately, that's a very hard nut to crack. because there's so many. See, the problem is well, it's like dominoes. If one falls, they all start to fall. So they all stand up to protect one another and cover up and obstruct any attempt to penetrate through their facade of lies.
Extremely unfortunate.
So
and it's also unfortunate.
Not too optimistic is what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, and forgive me for being tired this morning, but and if I've asked this before, but do you have any advice for the public that want to help, that don't have access to huge Twitter followings or haven't written books and they haven't served in the NSA for years? You know, like, how can the average person, in your opinion, help put pressure on, you know, both Ecuador and the United States to hopefully, you know, get Assange out of the embassy into Ecuador safely, or back to Australia safely?
Well, I think the only thing the public can do, I think, and the best thing probably for them to do, is to voice their opinion. You know, a standard principle is if you have a squeaky wheel, it gets the oil. So squeak, get out there and squeak to the U.S. and also Ecuador. Squeak to the both of them. They have an embassy here in the U.S. Send them an email or something, or send them a note, or call them. Do something to support, lend support. I mean, otherwise, you won't be recognized as a squeaky wheel, and you won't get any oil, you won't get any results. You know, it's like saying you never know, you might get what you ask for, so ask, you know? And the point is that when you do ask, it shows, it gives the clear impression that people are concerned. And that's and they're not buying the crap they're being fed by the mainstream media or anybody else.
Absolutely. Incredibly important point. And I know that a lot of people have signed petitions and they've donated what they can. And so that's always really heartwarming to hear, the generosity of just normal people who appreciate the work that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have done. I feel like because of your history and your journey through whistleblowing, and also your own experience of being sort of persecuted by the state as a result of your integrity, can you speak to what Julian Assange is going through on that kind of human level, where with the injustice of the attack he's experiencing in that way?
Well, you know, I did visit Julian once in the embassy there, and when I was going to with Chris Hedges to the Oxford debates about Edward Snowden in I think it was February of 2014, and he's in a really confined area there. He doesn't have a lot of room to move around even. So cutting off anything, it's just. Well, like I said before, it's a form of torture. It's a form of mental isolation, trying to, defeat people emotionally and mentally and so on. And over time, that's the kinds of techniques that the psychiatrists for CIA, for the torture program, when they laid that out, here's what you need to do for torture. And these were parts of those principles, how to isolate people mentally. And to get them, break them down mentally. So, I just look at this as a basic violation of humanity, and governments. This was contrived and pushed by Dick Cheney. I call him Darth Cheney because he went to the dark side. So
I think it's pretty apt. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So. I look at it this way: he was the one who helped promote this, but I'm not sure that was. I mean, the U.S. government, I think, has been doing some rather nasty things over time, depending on places like even Syria to torture people. We would send people to, like, for example, when they rendered a fellow by the name of Ara, I believe, he was a Canadian citizen. And they rendered him to Syria for torture for 6 months out of the JFK airport in New York. And when it was based on a tip that came from the Canadians to the U.S. intelligence people saying, this guy, it looks like he might be this terrorist. because the name, I think, was similar or something. It was some confusing point to it. But anyway, it's a big mistake. So they rendered this an innocent guy for torture by the Syrians. We are depending on the Syrians to do the torture. So we could say, oh, our hands are clean. We didn't do the torture, right? So how are you going to find out about this unless you can find that truth? I mean, but the point is that we used other people in other countries to do our dirty work. So knowing about that kind of says, well, what is our government doing? I mean, the Canadian government admitted to having done this by mistake, and they paid him, I think, $12 million Canadian dollars as retribution. The U.S. government has still denied any participation in it. So
exactly.
So
the lack of accountability is worse.
Yeah, they tried to make it so they always have plausible deniability. So they can always come back and say, like the argument in the courts is, you don't have standing, you don't have a basis to do the lawsuits or something, or you don't have proof. And if you don't have proof, that's because it's classified, and because it's classified, you can't see it, so you'll never get it. So, it's like a circular argument. You're always trapped in that loop. You can't get out of it, and you can't get past it. Well, that's the way the whole corrupt organization of government and industry and the mainstream media, that's how they work. So, the only way to break through it is to have people like WikiLeaks and others come out and say, expose what's really true.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And from your perspective, how do you see WikiLeaks moving forward on, not just the situation with Julian Assange in the embassy, but the situation with WikiLeaks as a publisher? How do you see that moving forward under the increasing, I mean, they've always been under massive pressure, but I can imagine that it's even more intense now. So what do you think is going to be the kind of the moving forward impetus of WikiLeaks as we continue to see Julian Assange isolated in the embassy?
Well, I know there's a number of people involved in WikiLeaks. I know some of them, but I don't know the entire network, and I don't think I need to know. So I'm not sure how much of it is left or how much there is. But I think that whatever there is will continue to try to do what Julian has started. So I don't believe that that's going to die. I mean, I think that's still going to go on. It's going to get more difficult, I think, if they start restricting the network and what you can do on the network. Although I think there's now in Europe, they're starting to have a move to try to create their own networks separate from the existing one. And there's some organizations trying to get that started, also to replace Google and Facebook and so on. So there's a counter-revolution. I mean, when Edward Snowden came out, I thought this would have been the greatest opportunity business-wise for most of the companies in Europe to start their own equivalent and basically have a competition with the existing technology people in California, basically. So, and when they didn't do that, I mean, they're very slow to operate to try to do that. I don't know why that's true, but that's the way it basically ended up. But for me, I thought that opportunity would have kind of turned around this whole spying business and made it quite difficult now for any government to spy on others. And I was trying to interject ways and means of being able to ensure that was still private. Like, for example, that tapping the lines, you could do a luminosity check at the input and the output at the end of a segment and check to see if there's any drop in the luminosity. If there was, you were tapped, So then you'd have to find out where the tap was and things like that. But it was ways that you could help verify that your security and privacy were still okay. And I think there are moves to try to do some of that.
Yeah, I so appreciate you explaining this type of details to the audience, because it is just it's the type of information that is very much unique in this stream. And I also wanted to ask you, when you see the type of persecution that not only Julian Assange has been put under, but also, Chelsea Manning, you were retaliated against as well. Ray McGovern, a fellow VIPS member of yours,
Yep.
being beaten badly. What
I
does
told him
that
he should never
say?
do that again, by the way. I said, you're too valuable, Ray, in terms of what you're writing and what you're saying. Don't put your body out there to get broken up and be in the hospital and out of action. You need to stay in action. I scolded him for that. When he was on earlier, but so I should have told you that before he came on.
Well, in any case, I'm always, it seems to me that the way you and Ray and everyone, all of the members of VIPS see this whole situation, it's in my personal opinion, it's true patriotism. And I think that I was wondering though, because I know that you all have had experiences of being persecuted or confined, just on the way in which you think that is either going to increase or decrease. Do you think that there will, in the next 10, 20 years, are there going to be future Bill Binneys and Ray McGoverns who are coming out in the way that you have, or is that just a fluke and a one-off thing?
No, I think that that's going to be happening. I mean, I don't see how I don't see how they can stop it, because when you basically end up being a torturer of people and violating everybody's rights and just basically randomly doing anything to people you want, simply because they're saying what they think or how they feel, then there are always going to be people who are not going to be able to tolerate that. And when you reach a point that this is the end, like in my case, I was staying inside government, talking to only government sources, the appropriate sources, by the way, the inspector generals and the intelligence committees and so on. But when I broke was when the Department of Justice and the FBI fabricated evidence to try to put us in jail and indict us. So when they fabricated, and I caught them at it, you see, and I also confronted them with it and told them that I was going to countercharge them when they took us to court. They just went away. This is sunlight, okay? When you have the truth, that's sunlight. And when you push the sunlight at people, especially, it's like lifting up a rock. You can see all the bugs and worms squirm to get out of the sunlight. That's what they're like, okay? That's what these people are like. So then they ran away. But that was the breaking point. At that point, it said to me that the government was so corrupt and so flawed in terms of their approach to just to life, that I had to start saying things publicly, because they were suppressing this kind of knowledge and so on to the public. So that was it. Then when Edward Snowden's material came out, I felt free to say just about anything. As long as I could point to that stuff, I could say, this is what that picture means. And this is what that picture is. This is how they're operating that, and what they're really doing with it, what they're really doing. Like congressmen have said that at various times on television that they're only spying on foreigners here in the internally in NSA. And then I said that, well, if you looked at the tapping points in the Fairview program, which spread across the United States, distributed with the population, more tapping points where the population is more dense, then that they're actually spying on U.S. citizens, and the target is us, not foreigners. And the reason I know that is because on that particular slide, the tapping points along the coast are where the transoceanic cables come into the U.S. Well, that's where all foreign communications come into the U.S. and go from the U.S. out, and also transit the U.S., come from like Europe to Japan. So all of that is right there at those 10 or 11 tapping points. And the rest of these things are not relevant to the foreigners. So the target is really us. And the slide shows that that's an absolute lie, and it has been from the beginning. And they just simply are not prepared to admit it. So I read that slide as an exhibit into a sworn affidavit to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in a lawsuit against the United States government for violating the constitutional rights of everybody in the country. Now, the government is trying to slow roll this and keep it going with the hope that eventually either I die or, we run out of money or something, And
Yeah.
a lot of this is being done by pro bono by lawyers who really are concerned. So, you know, we're not going to run out of money, so they have to hope that I die so I can't testify. But I put that in sworn affidavits in the court of law. I'm liable for, you know, perjury to the court for that. But I'm prepared to testify as to exactly what these programs do because I helped invent half of them. So, you know.
Yeah, and I actually would like to ask you about that because I'm aware of a little bit of that background. But if you'd like to explain to our viewers who don't know about your work within the NSA, if you want to speak about kind of the corruption you saw there before you left and the reason you did ultimately leave, that I think it's really helpful for our viewers to understand that.
Actually, Fritz Moser made a movie about this. It's called A Good American. And it kind of explains all the background, goes into it much more detail. But the point was pretty simple. I was actually focused in on solving a mission problem. So if you have a function in an organization, you're supposed to do X, you know, and in order to do X, you have to solve certain things or develop certain capabilities. And so if you focused on doing that, why you can actually solve and do the mission. Well, see, the point is that government agencies need a problem to go to Congress to get money to fund the activities that they want to do. So if you solve the problem, you don't have the problem to go to Congress to get the money. So I'll call these companies, this is this incestuous relationship again. All these companies that are involved don't want the problem solved because then they can't get a follow-on contract for more money. Originally, when I was dealing with contractors back in the started in the late 70s, but then mainly in the 80s. I thought their vision statement was aim low and miss because they failed all the time. You know, that was my opinion anyway. But then later on, it became very clear to me, no, it's not that. It's their vision statement is and government's a participant in this. This is what Eisenhower was talking about. It's keeping the problem going so the money keeps flowing. That's their whole point about is getting money and so on. So, you know, I just felt that was not something I could, and their whole objective then was more about money and budget than it was about solving the problem. But that's why all these terrorist attacks are occurring, because we're not solving the problem. You know, we're just keeping this flow of money going to these contractors so they can feed. And so if you don't solve the problem, this is like that festering issue that never gets fixed because you don't face it. If you don't face this corruption and fraud and waste that's going on, then you can't solve the problem. And as a result, people die all over the world. I mean, it's the same problem all over the world because they're all doing the same thing. They're joining the Five Eyes in their operation, which is bulk acquisition, bulk spying, you know. And it means you can't see the threat coming in advance because there's too much data to look at. And that's really the basic fundamental problem. Whereas we were trying to solve that by doing a focused, targeted attack based on behavioral properties that evidence some form of, you know, either threatening intent or criminality. And when we were doing that, we were doing it within the law and in accordance with the constitutional rights of humanity. So, and it actually was working. And so in order to get rid of that internally, they had to kill that program, and that's exactly what they did. So the only thing they took out of it was the back end that was my design on how to monitor the entire world and do it using metadata instead of actually looking at the data. So yeah, that's all explained in that movie, by the way.
It's a great movie. I've seen it. It's a wonderful movie, but I wanted to allow you to talk about it or ask you to talk about it for any members of the audience who haven't seen it. It's a fantastic film, and I think that it's such a great segue into the way WikiLeaks is that sunlight that you're talking about, because it is the one that is exposing so much of this corruption.
What I like about WikiLeaks also is that they do it, they just do it verbatim. You know, it's not, they don't tamper with the raw data. When they have the raw data, they publish it. Too many other people are interpreting it. You know, and if they don't really fundamentally understand it, they have a high likelihood or a high probability of making a mistake in their interpretation.
True.
So
That's a really good point.
that's why it's important to put the raw data out there. Also, if you want to have an interpretation, that's fine, but you need the raw data. But so far, many people haven't been doing that. Certainly not as completely as they need to.
Definitely. And I think that the growing niche of independent journalism pretty much couldn't operate if it wasn't for WikiLeaks. And so I think that the follow-on effect from them exposing the corruption and then a whole new niche of journalism coming back to report on it is one positive aspect of all this. But I guess as a kind of final question in this segment with you, as we know, Julian Assange cannot actually, he can't access this stream. And I don't know if he will be able to ever view it, but if you have anything you'd like to address to Julian Assange, I think that would be really fantastic to hear. So,
well, all I could say is hang in there, Julian. I think we're all with you. Certainly, we are trying to express our opinions here and doing the best we can to get public support for you. We actually need you, Julian, so hang in there and don't give up. We're still there fighting, so stay with us.